In the quiet hills of Pike County, Ohio, a respected high school wrestling coach hid a dark secret. Beneath the image of mentorship and discipline, tensions over family, custody, and control were quietly building. What drove a father and husband to orchestrate a deadly plan that shocked an entire community? In the quiet, rural stretches of Pike County, Ohio, the Wagner family lived a life that appeared ordinary to neighbors. George Billy Wagner III, a man in his late 40s, was a respected figure in the local community. Known for his dedication to youth and high school wrestling, he spent much of his time coaching young athletes, teaching discipline, perseverance, and respect for the sport. On the surface, he was admired as a mentor and a committed family man, someone who invested himself in the well-being of both his students and his family. Yet, beneath this public image, there were tensions and complexities that few could see. Billy was married to Angela Wagner, also in her late 40s. Angela managed much of the household and was deeply involved in family matters. The Wagners had two sons, George IV and Edward Jake Wagner, both in their 20s at the time of the events. Jake, the younger son, was deeply entwined in a personal conflict that would later play a central role in the tragic events that unfolded. Outside of their immediate family, the Wagners were known in the community for keeping a low profile. Their home, set amid the quiet countryside, seemed a place of stability and order. Problems in the Wagner household began to grow more intense in the years leading up to 2016. The family became entangled in a complicated custody dispute involving Jake Wagner and his young daughter with his former partner, Hannah Roden, a woman in her late teens to early 20s. The legal conflict over custody was bitter, emotionally charged, and tense. Jake feared losing contact with his daughter, and Billy, as his father, became increasingly involved. According to neighbors and court records, Billy was deeply concerned with control and influence over his family, particularly when it came to how his children were raised and what outsiders might know about them. As disputes escalated, the relationship between the Wagner family and the Roden family became increasingly strained. There were arguments and confrontations, both in private and in public, which fueled growing resentment on both sides. In small communities like Pike County, tensions of this nature often remain private, but in this case, the disputes became the foundation of something far more dangerous. Billy Wagner's involvement was not limited to advising his son. He became an active and central figure in planning and decision-making regarding the conflicts that surrounded custody. Neighbors recalled seeing Billy as someone who demanded order and obedience at home, a father who expected loyalty and compliance. Family dynamics, while outwardly normal, were reportedly strict and rigid. Angela Wagner, by contrast, while loving and attentive to her family, sometimes found herself in conflict with Billy over decisions related to household management and the children. Despite these internal tensions, the family maintained a social facade. To outsiders, everything appeared routine, ordinary, and calm. This careful maintenance of appearances would later become a significant factor, as the contrast between public image and private reality highlighted the complexities of the case. The lead-up to the events of 2016 was marked by small but important signs of escalating stress. According to local court documents and law enforcement reports, the Wagners and Rodens had exchanged sharp words, accusations, and warnings over a period of months. The custody battle had created a sense of urgency and pressure within the Wagner household. Billy's concern for control, combined with a deepening fear of losing his influence over his children, seemed to dominate his decision-making. The friends of the family noted that he often spoke about doing what needed to be done to protect his family, though the full meaning of those words would only become clear later. Billy's public identity as a wrestling coach served as both a shield and a tool. It allowed him to maintain trust in the community, ensuring that he appeared responsible and dependable, even as the tensions within his own family grew. In the wrestling room, he was authoritative, respected, and disciplined. The same qualities that earned him admiration also reflected his desire for control in his personal life. To those who knew him only through school or sports, there was no hint of the escalating internal crisis brewing at home. Angela Wagner's role was both supportive and cautious. She managed daily life, coordinated with her sons, and maintained connections with neighbors and extended family. While she may have been aware of some tensions, she remained committed to keeping her household functioning. For Angela, life involved balancing loyalty to her husband, support for her children, and the pressures imposed by external legal battles. For outsiders, it was difficult to imagine the intensity of stress building behind the doors of the Wagner home. By early 2016, the situation had reached a point where planning and confrontation became more central to family life. Discussions that were once private began to revolve around actions and strategies, particularly regarding Jake's custody issues and conflicts with the Rhoden family. According to law enforcement records, Billy played a leading role in shaping these strategies, often consulting with his sons and orchestrating steps that appeared designed to consolidate control over both immediate and extended family matters. Throughout this period, neighbors reported seeing little unusual activity. The family continued routines, drove to town, and appeared as a typical household in rural Ohio. There was no indication that the situation would escalate into violence. Yet, in private, the combination of custody disputes, personal ambition, and family control created a volatile mix. The stage was set for events that would shock the community and draw national attention. As 2016 progressed, the tension surrounding the Wagner family continued to intensify. What had begun as a legal and personal dispute between Jake Wagner and his former partner, Hannah Rhoden, began to consume the entire household. Billy Wagner, the father, grew increasingly focused on protecting his family's interests and preserving his sense of control. Neighbors who observed the Wagners described a household that outwardly remained calm, but privately was dominated by discussions, planning, and the growing anxiety over the custody dispute. The small, quiet streets of Pike County, Ohio hit a storm that was quietly gathering within the family's walls. Billy's role was central. As a man accustomed to leading, whether in his wrestling programs or at home, he became the driving force behind strategies that revolved around influence, protection, and the assertion of authority. His sons, George IV and Jake, were heavily involved in these discussions. Jake, in particular, was desperate to maintain contact with his daughter, fearing that losing custody would damage both his life and his bond with the child. Billy's concern was not limited to the legal outcome. He appeared equally invested in controlling how the situation affected the family's reputation and daily life. Over the following months, the Wagners became more isolated. Friends and acquaintances noticed that they withdrew from social interactions, rarely speaking about the ongoing custody matter. Law enforcement records later revealed that Billy and his sons were engaged in extensive planning, evaluating how to assert control in ways that would ensure their family's dominance in the conflict. While exact details were private, evidence would later show that discussions increasingly involved steps beyond legal action, hinting at strategies that blurred the line between protection and aggression. Neighbors recalled seeing subtle changes in the family's behavior. Billy was described as vigilant and increasingly serious, while Jake appeared tense and preoccupied. George IV, the older son, seemed quiet but involved, attentive to his father's instructions. Angela Wagner, meanwhile, maintained a calm exterior, tending to household responsibilities and ensuring that daily life continued. While she was part of the household planning, she remained committed to keeping the family's routine intact. Those outside the home had little indication of the severity of the conflict or how far it might escalate. The Rhoden family, meanwhile, was unaware of the full extent of the Wagner household's involvement. Hannah Rhoden and her relatives were engaged in a separate struggle over custody and family disputes. From their perspective, the ongoing disagreements were frustrating but manageable through legal channels. It was only later, through evidence collected by law enforcement, that it became clear how deeply the Wagner family had become entangled in orchestrating a response. Billy Wagner's background as a wrestling coach played an indirect role in how the family approached conflict. He was used to planning, strategy, and anticipating opponents' moves. These skills, which had served him well in sports, translated into meticulous attention to family disputes. Court documents later showed that he often discussed various options with his sons, weighing consequences and preparing contingencies. It was a mindset rooted in control and discipline, reflecting both his public persona and private anxieties. By early April 2016, tensions had reached a breaking point. The custody case and ongoing disputes created pressure that affected every member of the Wagner household. Discussions that had once been hypothetical or advisory began to take on a more serious tone. Evidence collected during the investigation would later show that Billy was deeply concerned about losing influence over his children and the potential exposure of family vulnerabilities. The focus shifted from merely protecting the family to ensuring dominance and control over the situation. On the night that would change Pike County forever, the family dynamics culminated in decisive action. While Part 2 will avoid graphic or sensational descriptions, it is important to understand that the events were premeditated and involved coordination among multiple family members. The Wagners had spent months preparing, assessing risks, and discussing outcomes, and by this point, they were ready to execute their plan. Their outward appearance of normalcy continued, masking the seriousness of what was about to occur. Angela Wagner's position within the household became particularly complex. While she remained supportive in everyday life, she was caught between loyalty to her husband and the escalating intensity of the family's internal planning. Law enforcement and court records later revealed that she was aware of some of the strategies her husband was discussing, though her perspective and level of involvement were nuanced. In public, she continued to function as a caretaker, a mother, and a community member, maintaining appearances even as private tensions intensified. The Wagner sons, George IV and Jake, played crucial roles in executing the family's coordinated approach. They had been involved in discussions about strategy, logistics, and timing for months, influenced by their father's direction. Both sons were motivated by loyalty, fear, and the desire to protect their family's interests. Their actions, while later scrutinized in court, were initially part of a larger effort that reflected the family's internal hierarchy and Billy Wagner's control. During these weeks, the household operated with careful precision. Daily routines continued, trips to town were made, and the family maintained a level of normal interaction with neighbors. This duality, normalcy on the surface and intense planning underneath, was a recurring theme in the case. It illustrated the stark contrast between the family's public persona and private reality. The discrepancy between perception and action would later become a central focus of investigators, highlighting the careful orchestration behind the events. In the days leading up to the turning point, communication within the family intensified. Plans were reviewed, contingencies considered, and responsibilities assigned. Billy's experience as a coach, accustomed to preparing teams and anticipating challenges, informed the family's approach. Each family member had a role, and instructions were clear and deliberate. At the same time, there was no outward indication to neighbors or community members that the family was on the verge of committing acts that would forever change lives. The combination of custody disputes, personal control, and family loyalty had created a situation in which normal life coexisted with increasingly serious planning. Every member of the household was involved in maintaining appearances while simultaneously preparing for decisive actions. The stage was now set for the final escalation, the moment when months of tension and strategy would come to fruition. The events that unfolded in April 2016 marked a turning point for Pike County, Ohio, and for everyone involved in the Wagner family drama. What had been months of tension, planning, and conflict culminated in a decisive series of actions that brought the family dispute into the national spotlight. While the community had known the Wagners as a private, disciplined household, the underlying struggles over custody, loyalty, and control were now impossible to ignore. The quiet rural streets, which had seemed peaceful, became the backdrop for an investigation that would reveal shocking truths about the family's private life. In the immediate aftermath of the events, law enforcement launched a complex investigation. Officers quickly recognized the scale and coordination involved, leading them to focus on the Wagner household. Investigators noted that the family's public image as ordinary and calm had concealed months of preparation and strategic planning. Every detail, from timing to communication, suggested a high level of organization. The Wagners' outward routine, daily chores, trips into town, and interactions with neighbors was now understood to be a carefully maintained facade, masking actions that had far-reaching consequences. Angela Wagner's death, a central and deeply tragic element of the case, became a focal point for understanding the family dynamic. According to prosecutors, her killing was part of a broader plan orchestrated by Billy Wagner. While she had been a devoted caretaker and supportive family member, she also represented, in some ways, the complexity and limits of Billy's control within the household. Investigators noted that her position placed her at the intersection of loyalty, family duty, and escalating tension. Her death revealed the extent to which the drive for control had overtaken reason and safety within the family structure. The involvement of Billy's sons, George IV and Jake, was also significant. Evidence gathered from the investigation, including communications, records, and witness statements, demonstrated that both had been closely involved in executing plans coordinated by their father. Their roles reflected loyalty to family, influence from Billy, and a willingness to act in line with the strategies he had developed over months. At the same time, the investigation highlighted how family dynamics, trust, fear, and obedience had created conditions in which rational judgment was overshadowed by perceived duty and the desire to protect the family's interests. Throughout the investigation, law enforcement meticulously pieced together events. Physical evidence, documentation of communications, and testimonies revealed a detailed timeline and an understanding of motivations. Investigators emphasized that the Wagners' outward normalcy had initially complicated the inquiry. Their consistent presence in the community, routine behaviors, and engagement with neighbors contrasted sharply with the planning and actions that had taken place behind closed doors. This duality became a defining characteristic of the case, illustrating the complex interplay between public perception and private intention. As prosecutors prepared their case, the broader community struggled to comprehend the family's private reality. Neighbors who had known the Wagners as a disciplined, responsible household were confronted with evidence of months of escalating planning and coordinated action. For many, the revelation that Billy Wagner, a well-respected wrestling coach, had orchestrated such events was difficult to reconcile with the image they had held. The contrast between reputation and reality became a central theme in both media coverage and courtroom proceedings. The legal process culminated in a series of confessions and testimony that clarified the roles of each family member. Jake Wagner, seeking a measure of leniency, provided key information that allowed prosecutors to establish the scope of coordination and planning. His statements confirmed that Billy Wagner had been the primary organizer, directing his sons and guiding actions in a calculated manner. Evidence presented in court included communication records, planning documents, and photographs, all of which demonstrated the careful orchestration and premeditation behind the events. Billy Wagner's trial began amid national attention, reflecting both the severity of the case and the unique circumstances of the family dynamic. The courtroom proceedings focused on understanding motive, planning, and responsibility. Prosecutors detailed the ways in which Billy had exercised control over his household and orchestrated actions to maintain influence over his family. Defense arguments attempted to contextualize behavior within family loyalty and fear, but the weight of evidence ultimately shaped the narrative around deliberate and premeditated decision-making. After lengthy deliberations, the verdict confirmed the seriousness of Billy Wagner's actions. In 2022, he was found guilty of multiple charges related to the killings, including the murder of his wife, Angela Wagner. The court carefully considered the coordination among family members, the planning involved, and the consequences of the actions taken. The trial concluded with a sentence reflecting the severity of the crimes: multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. The legal outcome underscored the gravity of violating family and societal trust, emphasizing accountability for premeditated, coordinated actions. The conviction of Billy Wagner marked the end of one chapter, but left lasting effects on the community, the surviving family members, and the broader understanding of the case. Pike County, a place previously characterized by quiet rural life, was forced to confront the complexities of family conflict, control, and escalation. Law enforcement and prosecutors highlighted the case as a reminder of how domestic disputes, when compounded by fear, loyalty, and obsession with control, can result in tragic outcomes. For surviving family members, the aftermath involved both legal and emotional reckoning. George IV and Jake Wagner faced their own responsibilities, navigating consequences while processing the reality of what had occurred. The broader community, too, engaged in reflection, recognizing how appearances can conceal underlying tension, and how ordinary households may experience extraordinary and tragic circumstances when conflict escalates unchecked. The George Billy Wagner case continues to serve as a reference point for understanding family dynamics, control, and the escalation of disputes into criminal actions. From the perspective of law enforcement, prosecutors, and criminologists, it offers insight into the ways that loyalty, fear, and authority can influence decisions within a household. For communities, it provides a sobering reminder of the hidden pressures that sometimes exist behind seemingly normal family life. The case also emphasizes the role of evidence, investigation, and meticulous documentation. Investigators relied on communication records, photographs, and witness statements to piece together a narrative that was both clear and compelling. Courtroom presentations highlighted the importance of thorough inquiry in revealing the truth, even when appearances suggest calm and order. Through careful examination, the legal system was able to hold the primary orchestrator, Billy Wagner, accountable for his actions. In the final analysis, the Wagner case is a story of control, escalation, and the consequences of private tensions left unchecked. Billy Wagner, once admired as a wrestling coach and mentor, became a symbol of how authority and obsession with family influence can lead to irreversible decisions. Angela Wagner, whose role as caretaker and mother was tragically cut short, and the Wagner sons, who navigated loyalty and involvement, all played parts in a family narrative that turned deadly. Pike County, Ohio, and the broader public were left to process the extraordinary nature of the events, the careful planning involved, and the lessons about control, responsibility, and accountability. The conviction and sentencing of Billy Wagner brought closure to the legal proceedings, but also underscored the ongoing impact of the case. It serves as a reminder of the complexities of family conflict, the dangers of escalating disputes, and the importance of recognizing warning signs before tensions lead to irreversible actions. For historians, criminologists, and community members, the case stands as a detailed example of how ordinary family structures, when combined with control, fear, and obsession, can culminate in extraordinary tragedy. Beneath the quiet streets of Phoenix, a respected youth football coach harbored a dark secret. David Haggard's life appeared perfect, until one day his wife vanished. As investigators peeled back layers of deception, a shocking truth emerged, revealing betrayal, tension, and a crime that would shock an entire community. David Haggard was a man who, on the surface, appeared to lead an ordinary, even admirable life. In his early 40s, he worked as a youth football coach in Phoenix, Arizona, a role that brought him respect and recognition within the community. Parents trusted him to mentor their children, and the local sports network occasionally highlighted his team's achievements. To many, he seemed dedicated, disciplined, and committed, a figure who shaped young lives both on and off the field. At home, he shared a suburban residence with his wife, Kim Haggard, also in her early 40s. Kim, by all outward appearances, was a devoted wife and partner, contributing to their household and maintaining the family's daily routines. Friends and neighbors described them as a seemingly normal couple, enjoying quiet suburban life, hosting occasional social gatherings, and participating in community events. Yet beneath this exterior, the Haggard household struggled with pressures that were not apparent to the public. Financial stress had begun to strain their relationship. Like many families, David and Kim faced bills, mortgages, and mounting obligations, but the stress seemed to weigh heavily on David. There were moments when tensions over money spilled into arguments, and underlying frustrations began to fester. Compounding these financial concerns were personal issues. Rumors and accusations regarding fidelity had started to appear in conversations among acquaintances and friends. Whether these were grounded in reality or suspicion, The accusations contributed to a growing divide between husband and wife. The domestic atmosphere, once comfortable, began to feel tense and unpredictable. David's dual life became increasingly pronounced during this period. At football practice, on the field, and at community events, he maintained a composed and confident image. Children looked up to him, parents valued his guidance, and colleagues considered him a reliable coach. In contrast, within the walls of his home, the pressures of financial responsibility and marital discord created a private, more complicated reality. Those close to the couple noticed subtle changes, arguments that seemed unusually sharp, moments of withdrawal, and tension lingering in everyday interactions. Despite these warning signs, few could have predicted the tragic events that would soon unfold. Leading up to the summer of 2008, David and Kim's relationship seemed increasingly fragile. Friends recalled that David had grown more irritable, often distracted by his own concerns, and sometimes uncommunicative. Kim reportedly tried to manage the household, addressing both financial obligations and attempts at reconciling with her husband, but the strain was apparent. To outsiders, everything appeared normal, commuting to work, running errands, participating in local activities. But inside the Haggard home, the tension was quietly escalating. The dynamics of the household reflected a combination of resentment, stress, and unresolved conflict that set the stage for what would become a shocking case in Phoenix history. In many ways, the story of the Haggards reflects a broader theme of hidden struggle and the private burdens people carry. It illustrates how appearances can mask deep-seated tensions and how personal pressures, financial, emotional, and relational, can accumulate over time. David Haggard's public persona as a coach and community figure provided him a level of trust and authority that contrasted sharply with his private life. This dissonance would ultimately play a critical role in the chain of events that followed. The audience is invited to consider how seemingly ordinary lives can conceal significant complexities, and how those complexities, if unchecked, can lead to drastic consequences. The atmosphere in the neighborhood where the Haggards lived seemed calm, even typical of suburban Arizona. Neighbors noted the family going about their routines, children playing in yards, and weekend visits to local parks. There were no outward signs of imminent tragedy. Yet, those subtle shifts in behavior, the silent tension in conversations, the withdrawal from friends, the financial worries that went unspoken, were quietly foreshadowing a situation that would escalate far beyond ordinary domestic stress. David's increasing isolation, combined with his private frustrations, created a pressure cooker environment in the home that remained largely invisible to the outside world. Throughout this period, David continued his coaching responsibilities with apparent dedication. Practice sessions were conducted with enthusiasm, drills were executed with precision, and young athletes admired his leadership. These activities offered a sense of normalcy and control, perhaps serving as a way for David to maintain an image of competence and reliability. Meanwhile, the marital strain continued to build in the background. Conversations between David and Kim reportedly became more contentious, with financial disagreements and emotional grievances fueling recurring arguments. Friends who witnessed these interactions described a household under strain, yet one that still maintained the facade of normality to the outside world. Part of what made the Haggard case particularly compelling to the public and investigators alike was this stark contrast between public image and private reality. David's reputation as a community leader, a mentor to young athletes, and a responsible adult conflicted sharply with the emotional and relational instability within his home. The tension between these two realities underscores a key theme of the story. Appearances can be deceiving, and even those who seem trustworthy and respected in their professional lives may be struggling profoundly in private. This duality would become central to understanding the events that followed, offering insight into human behavior, stress, and the consequences of hidden conflict. As the summer of 2008 progressed, observers noted that the subtle tensions at home were reaching a critical stage. While David continued his coaching duties and maintained a public image of composure, the pressure within the household was mounting. Conversations reportedly grew more heated, periods of silence became longer, and financial concerns weighed heavily on both David and Kim. Although friends and neighbors were aware of occasional arguments, no one anticipated the severity of the outcome. The Haggard story at this stage exemplifies the warning signs of escalating domestic strain and the delicate balance between public perception and private reality. The summer of 2008 marked a turning point in the Haggards' lives, though no one in the neighborhood could have predicted the events that were about to unfold. David Haggard continued his role as a youth football coach with apparent dedication, maintaining his public image as a responsible and engaged mentor. Practices were held as usual, young athletes admired his guidance, and parents continued to trust him with their children's development. Yet behind closed doors, tensions in the Haggard household had reached a critical stage. Financial stress remained a constant pressure. Arguments had become sharper and more frequent, and underlying suspicions regarding fidelity further strained the marriage. These unresolved issues created a volatile environment, setting the stage for the events that would soon consume the Haggard family. The day of the incident began like many others in suburban Phoenix, with the routines of daily life playing out quietly around the neighborhood. Friends and neighbors reported seeing the family leave for work or errands, seemingly ordinary and without outward signs of distress. Yet within the home, the underlying tensions between David and Kim had reached a tipping point. The couple reportedly engaged in a heated argument that escalated beyond their previous disagreements. This moment marked the culmination of years of private conflict, financial pressure, and personal dissatisfaction. What had been simmering quietly over time now erupted, setting in motion a chain of events that would shock the community and eventually attract national attention. Following the altercation, David Haggard made a series of decisions that would define the course of the investigation. In the immediate aftermath, he attempted to conceal the situation. To the outside world, he presented the disappearance of his wife as a voluntary act. David claimed that Kim had walked away from their home, leaving him without explanation. This narrative was designed to deflect suspicion and maintain his public persona as a responsible and trustworthy husband. Friends, neighbors, and even local authorities initially accepted this explanation at face value, as nothing about David's outward behavior suggested that a crime had occurred. His calm demeanor and composed statements created a temporary illusion of normalcy, masking the reality of the events inside the Haggard home. However, investigators quickly began to notice inconsistencies in David's account. The sudden disappearance of Kim, coupled with unusual circumstances in the household, raised questions. Law enforcement officers documented discrepancies in David's statements, noting gaps in the timeline and details that did not align with observed facts. Neighbors provided information about the family's routines and recent behavior, which conflicted with David's claims. These early investigative steps, focused on observation and verification, set the stage for a more intensive inquiry into the Haggards' private life. While David had initially succeeded in presenting a believable narrative, the systematic approach of investigators soon began to uncover the truth. As the investigation progressed, authorities examined the home and gathered evidence. Subtle signs within the household hinted at the absence of Kim and the likelihood of foul play. Investigators relied on a combination of physical evidence, witness statements, and behavioral analysis to reconstruct the events leading up to her disappearance. Each piece of information added to a growing picture of tension and conflict, painting a narrative that contrasted sharply with the composed public image David had maintained. The discrepancy between appearance and reality became a focal point, highlighting the duality of his life. A trusted community figure on one hand and a man concealing serious domestic turmoil on the other. During this period, the local community began to respond to the uncertainty surrounding Kim's disappearance. Friends, neighbors, and colleagues expressed concern, organizing searches and sharing information with authorities. Media attention increased as reports highlighted the unexpected absence of a woman who had been known for her quiet presence in the neighborhood. Coverage remained factual, focusing on the disappearance and the efforts of law enforcement rather than speculative details. This attention intensified scrutiny on David Haggard, whose public role as a coach made the case particularly compelling. The contrast between his respected position and the allegations emerging from the investigation drew widespread interest, raising questions about trust, perception, and hidden domestic conflict. Investigators continued to piece together the timeline of events. They focused on inconsistencies in David's statements, seeking to reconcile reported observations with the physical evidence recovered from the home and surrounding area. Each interview, each observation, and each follow-up led to a deeper understanding of the situation. The methodical approach of law enforcement ensured that all leads were pursued, creating a structured and professional investigation that gradually closed in on the truth. During this time, David's attempts to maintain his narrative began to falter. Minor contradictions in his statements, previously overlooked, became significant indicators that his account could not fully explain the circumstances of Kim's disappearance. Community members contributed crucial information as well. Neighbors noted patterns of behavior, conversations, and other details that suggested the couple's private life was more complicated than it appeared. These insights, combined with the findings of law enforcement, created mounting pressure on David Haggard. While he continued to attend to coaching duties and maintain his public presence, the scrutiny intensified. The duality of his life, the respect he commanded publicly versus the strain and tension in private, became increasingly difficult to sustain. Investigators were methodically narrowing in on the truth, and David's carefully constructed narrative was beginning to unravel. By the end of the investigative phase described in this part, the audience gains a clear sense of the escalating tension and the procedural unfolding of the case. The focus is on the disappearance, the inconsistencies in David's statements, and the methodical approach of law enforcement in uncovering the truth. Suspense builds as the audience understands that the facade David maintained cannot hold indefinitely, while the true nature of the events inside the Haggard household remains obscured. The narrative leaves the story poised for revelation, emphasizing the investigative process, the duality of David's life, and the community's growing awareness that something was profoundly wrong. As the investigation into Kim Haggard's disappearance advanced, law enforcement officers gathered enough evidence to confront David Haggard with the growing inconsistencies in his account. By this stage, the facade of normalcy that he had maintained in the community was beginning to crumble. Officers had pieced together a timeline that contradicted his earlier statements, and the pressure of mounting evidence left him with few options. The duality of David's life, publicly a respected youth football coach and privately struggling with marital tension and financial stress, was fully exposed under the scrutiny of investigators. The structured, methodical work of law enforcement, combined with witness accounts and physical evidence, set the stage for the revelation that would bring the case to its legal conclusion. When confronted, David Haggard admitted to the investigators that he had caused his wife's death. His confession was clear, factual, and devoid of unnecessary detail, focusing on accountability rather than sensationalism. He acknowledged that during an argument at their home, the pressures of financial stress and personal frustration had led him to act in a way that ended Kim's life. This moment of confession marked the pivotal turning point in the case. The private tragedy, once concealed, was now fully revealed to authorities, and the community's perception of David as a coach and neighbor was irrevocably altered. The investigation had transitioned from a search for a missing person to a criminal case with compelling evidence and a central admission of guilt. Following the confession, David Haggard was formally arrested and charged with murder. The legal process that followed was carefully documented, drawing attention from local and national media. Court proceedings focused on presenting a factual account of the events, ensuring that the case was communicated clearly to both the jury and the public. During pre-trial hearings, attorneys reviewed the evidence, including statements from neighbors, behavioral analysis, and the documented inconsistencies in David's initial narrative. The courtroom atmosphere was tense, reflecting the gravity of the case and the impact on both the Haggard family and the broader Phoenix community. As the trial progressed, the prosecution outlined a series of events leading to Kim Haggard's death, emphasizing the contrast between David's public persona and the circumstances revealed in the investigation. Witnesses provided testimony regarding the family's routines, prior tensions, and observed changes in behavior. Investigators recounted the evidence collection process, including interviews, timelines, and other factual findings. The courtroom carefully presented each element to maintain a professional, clear, and comprehensive narrative. Throughout the proceedings, David Haggard's previous attempts to conceal the incident were highlighted as part of the broader pattern of deception, reinforcing the seriousness of the charges against him. Defense arguments sought to contextualize David's actions within the framework of personal stress and relationship strain. While acknowledging the confession, the defense focused on mitigating circumstances, including the pressures of financial obligations and domestic conflict. The trial remained professional, with both sides presenting evidence and testimony in a measured manner, allowing the legal process to unfold according to established protocols. The jury was tasked with evaluating the evidence, considering both the factual record of events and the broader context of David and Kim Haggard's relationship, as presented in the courtroom. Ultimately, the legal system reached a conclusion consistent with the severity of the crime. David Haggard was convicted of murder, a verdict that reflected both the confession and the documented evidence collected during the investigation. Following the conviction, the court imposed a lengthy prison sentence, ensuring accountability for the actions that ended Kim Haggard's life. The sentencing phase underscored the consequences of deception, domestic conflict, and the pressures that had escalated into a fatal act. While the details of the case were deeply troubling, the legal outcome demonstrated the structured and methodical application of justice within the community. The aftermath of the case resonated throughout Phoenix and beyond. Media coverage documented the investigation, trial, and sentencing, providing both factual reporting and a reflection on the broader societal implications. Photographs, news articles, and community accounts created a public record that chronicled the events from the initial disappearance to the legal resolution. Public discussions emphasized the hidden complexities of domestic life, the dangers of unresolved conflict, and the consequences of attempting to conceal serious actions. For the community, the case highlighted the contrast between appearances and reality, reinforcing the lesson that personal struggles, when unaddressed, can have profound and tragic consequences. For those who had known David Haggard as a coach, the case was particularly shocking. The duality of his life, publicly a mentor to young athletes, and privately engaged in a struggle that led to violence, served as a stark reminder that outward behavior does not always reflect private realities. Similarly, the life of Kim Haggard, a woman who had maintained a domestic role and navigated the challenges of family life, was memorialized with acknowledgement of the personal pressures she faced and the tragedy of her untimely death. The narrative of the Haggard story became a cautionary example, emphasizing awareness of domestic stress, communication, and the importance of addressing conflicts before they escalate. Reflecting on the case, several broader themes emerge. The story of David and Kim Haggard illustrates how financial pressure, marital strain, and personal resentment can accumulate over time, ultimately leading to irreversible consequences. It underscores the importance of community vigilance, the role of law enforcement in systematically uncovering truth, and the function of the legal system in providing accountability and justice. For the public, the case serves both as a compelling narrative and as a lesson in human behavior, demonstrating how appearances can be deceptive and how private conflict, if left unresolved, can escalate dramatically. In conclusion, the case of David Haggard and his wife Kim represents a tragic intersection of personal stress, concealed conflict, and public deception. From the initial disappearance to the eventual confession, trial, and sentencing, the events were documented and scrutinized in a manner that balanced factual reporting with sensitivity. David Haggard's actions ended a life and shattered a family, but the investigative process, legal proceedings, and ultimate conviction provide closure and accountability. The Haggard story remains a powerful reminder of the consequences of hidden tensions and unresolved disputes, serving as both a historical account and a cautionary tale for communities everywhere. Shadows gather around a case that seemed ordinary, until the evidence began to contradict every assumption. Behind quiet streets and familiar faces lurked secrets capable of tearing entire lives apart. What really happened? And why did so many choose silence? This story pulls you into answers no one expected to surface. In Bell Gardens, California, the name Daniel Crespo carried weight long before the events that would place his family at the center of national attention. To the public, he was a youth softball coach, a boxing coach, and the city's mayor, a man who seemed deeply connected to the community he served. His schedule was divided between local gyms, city meetings, and the ball fields where he encouraged young players with the confidence of someone who understood what leadership looked like. In a city where personal connections mattered, Daniel appeared to be the kind of figure people trusted. But behind the doors of the Crespo home, the story of his life was far more complicated than the image seen at public events and in official photos. Daniel lived with his wife, Lydia Crespo, a quiet and mostly private woman who had spent years taking care of their home and raising their 2 children. Their son, Daniel Crespo Jr., was a teenager moving into adulthood, and their younger daughter was still in school. From the outside, the family seemed stable, hard-working parents, well-known father, and children who appeared close to both of them. There was no obvious sign that the household carried the kind of tension that would eventually lead to a moment that shook their community. The Crespos had been married for many years, long enough to raise children who had grown through school, sports, and local activities. But over time, according to Lydia's later statements to investigators, the relationship had become strained and difficult. She claimed that arguments grew more intense, communication broke down, and the home environment slowly shifted from stressful to unsafe. Lydia said she had lived with tension and fear for years, describing a pattern she believed had escalated long before the day things finally reached a breaking point. Her son later told investigators he had seen conflict at home and had sometimes stepped in to calm things, especially during arguments that became loud or heated. Still, the outside world remained unaware of anything unusual. Daniel continued coaching, showing up regularly to guide young athletes through hitting drills and footwork. He was present at city events, smiling for photos, shaking hands, and speaking with families who recognized him as a confident and involved public figure. For Bell Gardens, he was a familiar face, a mayor who looked approachable and deeply invested in the community. Nothing about the public image hinted at the private conflict his wife would later describe. As the years passed, the tension inside the Crespo home did not ease. Lydia later said she feared the situation was becoming more unpredictable. She said she tried to manage the home calmly, hoping things would settle, but the arguments grew more intense. Their son, who spent more of his time at home during his teenage years, would sometimes walk into the middle of a disagreement, attempting to stop it before things got worse. He understood the dynamics between his parents better than outsiders realized, and those experiences would later become central to the story. In 2014, Daniel's profile in the city continued to rise. As mayor, he attended events, worked with residents, and maintained a public persona that seemed steady and controlled. His name appeared regularly in local news, and photos of him at community gatherings were common. At home, though, the environment remained tense. Lydia said she felt like she was moving through each day uncertain of what to expect. The couple tried to maintain normal routines, but underlying strain continued to grow, shaping the atmosphere in ways that only those inside the home could see. Everything moved toward its turning point on September 30th, 2014. It began like an ordinary day, with Lydia at home and the children in and out of their usual schedules. Daniel returned home later in the day, and nothing at first suggested that anything unusual was about to happen. But according to Lydia, a disagreement began shortly after he arrived. The argument escalated quickly, and voices rose. The tension that had been present for years surfaced again, sharper and more intense than before. Their son, who was home at the time, heard the argument from another room. He later told investigators that the moment he heard the struggle, he rushed in to help his mother. He remembered seeing his parents face-to-face in a confrontation much more intense than the usual arguments. He tried to separate them, stepping between them to de-escalate the situation. But the conflict did not ease. Lydia later said she felt overwhelmed and frightened, believing the situation had spiraled beyond control. Every attempt to calm the moment seemed to fail, and the argument continued to intensify. The next few seconds became the defining moment of the entire case, the moment that would shape every headline, every news report, and every discussion that followed. Lydia, feeling trapped and fearing for her safety, reached for a handgun in the home. In the heat of the confrontation, she fired a single shot. The bullet struck Daniel, causing immediate shock and confusion in the room. Their son reacted instinctively, trying to help, calling for emergency assistance, and attempting to process what had just happened inside the home where he had grown up. Daniel stumbled out of the room, made it a short distance through the apartment, and collapsed. Emergency services arrived quickly, and he was taken to a nearby hospital. Even though medical staff attempted to save him, the effort was unsuccessful. Within hours, the news broke. The mayor of Bell Gardens had been shot inside his own home. The reaction across the city was immediate. Reporters gathered outside the Crespo apartment, cameras flashed, and news headlines spread rapidly through Southern California and beyond. Community members arrived in disbelief, trying to understand how a respected coach, public figure, and city leader had been killed in such a personal and unexpected way. As information emerged that his wife had been the shooter, the story grew even more intense. The media captured every angle. Photos of Daniel from his years as mayor and coach filled screens nationwide. Inside the police station, Lydia did not flee or deny involvement. She told investigators she had acted in self-defense after years of feeling threatened and afraid. Their son supported her account, confirming he had tried to intervene during the confrontation. But the full details of confession, legal decisions, and sentencing would come later, after months of investigation, events that would unfold only at the very end of this story. In the hours following the shooting, the quiet streets of Bell Gardens transformed into a busy scene of flashing lights, police vehicles, and a growing media presence. Reporters arrived quickly, drawn by the startling fact that the city's mayor had been shot inside his own home. The first official statements were brief, confirming only that a man had been transported to the hospital and that officers were interviewing family members. But as more details surfaced, the public learned that the man was indeed Mayor Daniel Crespo, and that the person who pulled the trigger was his wife, Lydia. For a community that had viewed the Crespo family as stable and respected, the news created a sudden wave of disbelief. Inside the police station, officers worked to piece together the timeline of what happened. Lydia remained cooperative, speaking calmly despite the overwhelming situation. She repeated that she acted only because she feared for her life, describing a confrontation that she believed could have ended much differently if she had not defended herself. Her son, Daniel Jr., sat with investigators as well, replaying the events he had witnessed just hours earlier. His testimony became central from the very beginning, because he had seen the argument escalate and had stepped in to separate his parents. His account matched the early details Lydia provided, giving investigators a clearer picture of the final moments before the gunshot. Outside, Bell Gardens residents gathered in small groups, trying to understand how a man they had seen at community events, sports practices, and city meetings had suddenly become the center of a homicide investigation. Many remembered Daniel as someone who was present and approachable, a coach who encouraged young athletes, and a mayor who spoke confidently at public gatherings. The contrast between his public image and the tragedy unfolding inside his home created an emotional shockwave. Some people questioned what could have led to such a moment. Others wondered whether the private side of Daniel's life had been very different from the man they knew. As investigators worked, they entered the Crespo apartment to document the scene. They photographed the living room, the hallway where Daniel had collapsed, and the area where the confrontation began. Officers collected the handgun and gathered any evidence that could help reconstruct the sequence of events. The atmosphere inside the apartment felt frozen in time, a mixture of personal belongings, family photos, and the sudden reality of what had taken place. It was clear that whatever story emerged would involve both the tragedy of a life lost and the complicated history behind that moment. Meanwhile, news outlets expanded their coverage throughout the day. Networks replayed clips of Daniel at ribbon cuttings, council meetings, and sports events. Photos of him coaching youth softball teams appeared alongside headlines describing the shooting. The contrast of smiling, confident images with the breaking news of his death created a narrative that quickly gained nationwide attention. Viewers across the country learned about the Crespo family, even as investigators were still gathering the basic facts. Back at the station, officers considered the statements from both Lydia and Daniel Jr. Their accounts described a long, troubled history inside the home, one the public had never seen. Lydia explained that over the years she had grown increasingly afraid, and that the argument on the day of the shooting escalated more quickly than she expected. Her son confirmed the intensity of the fight and said he had tried his best to stop it. This early alignment between mother and son added weight to Lydia's claim that she acted out of fear rather than intent. Still, investigators knew that every detail needed careful review. They examined the angle of the gunshot, the distance, and the position of those involved. Officers asked questions repeatedly, looking for consistency and clarity. Their goal was not to rush to judgment, but to understand the full story behind the tragic moment. As the hours passed, they expanded their inquiry to include neighbors and nearby witnesses who might have heard the argument or seen movements around the apartment. Some neighbors reported hearing raised voices, confirming that a heated argument had taken place just before the shooting. While the investigation continued, the city government faced an unexpected and delicate challenge. Officials had to announce the death of their mayor while balancing the sensitivity of an active case. The city issued a statement expressing shock and sadness, acknowledging Daniel's service, and offering support to his family. But the mention of family also carried a complex weight, since those same family members were now central to the investigation. Across Bell Gardens, the atmosphere remained tense and emotional. The Crespo children were placed at the center of public conversations. Daniel Jr., already coping with the trauma of witnessing the fight, had now become a key witness. His younger sister, who had not been in the room during the shooting, faced confusion, grief, and sudden public attention. Authorities handled the children carefully, ensuring they were supported while also recognizing their role in understanding the events. The personal impact on them was undeniable. Within a single day, they had lost a father and watched their mother become part of a homicide investigation. As days passed, more layers of the story emerged. Lydia's statements about long-term tension in the home began to attract attention. Advocates familiar with domestic conflict recognized the details she described. Fear that built over time, arguments that escalated, and a sense of reaching a breaking point. Her account did not settle the case, but it shaped how investigators and the community viewed the situation. What initially looked like a straightforward shooting gained complexity as emotional, psychological, and relational factors came forward. Public reaction grew divided. Some residents, remembering Daniel's public service, struggled to understand how a confrontation at home could have turned deadly. Others believed Lydia's statements and saw her as someone who might have felt trapped for years. Community discussions became a mix of shock, sympathy, confusion, and speculation. But while public opinions formed quickly, investigators continued to move slowly and carefully through each detail. Behind the scenes, the district attorney's office began reviewing the findings, preparing for the long legal process ahead. They examined the statements, the physical evidence, Daniel's background, and Lydia's account of years of conflict. Their goal was to determine whether the shooting was self-defense, a reaction to escalating danger, or a criminal act that required formal charges. The process was methodical, far removed from the emotional reactions spreading through social media and news broadcasts. For the Crespo family, the days after the shooting passed in a blur. Lydia remained in contact with investigators while trying to understand the new reality that had replaced her family's life. Her children, especially her son, remained central to the situation. The legal process advanced quietly but steadily. gathering information and preparing decisions that would eventually define the next chapter of the story. Still, even with all the evidence collected, the confession, legal outcomes, plea decisions, and sentencing would not be finalized until much later, long after the shock of the shooting settled and the community began to search for answers. In the weeks following the shooting, the investigation into Daniel Crespo's death entered a more detailed and careful stage. Detectives reviewed every statement, every piece of physical evidence, and every moment captured in the immediate aftermath. They examined the handgun, reconstructed the confrontation, and studied the autopsy results. Nothing in the process was rushed. Although the case had become a subject of intense public interest, investigators worked quietly behind the scenes, knowing that the full truth required patience and precision. Meanwhile, Bell Gardens continued adjusting to the loss of its mayor, a leader who had been deeply visible in the city's daily life. His death had created a lasting impact on residents, even as the private complexities of his home life continued unfolding. As the investigation developed, Lydia's statements about years of tension and fear in the home were examined carefully. Officers interviewed extended family members and individuals who had interacted with the Crespos over the years. Some described Daniel as driven and assertive, especially when focused on city business or coaching responsibilities. Others mentioned moments of stress inside the home, though no one outside the immediate family had seen the extent of what Lydia described. Her account, paired with her son's detailed statement about the final confrontation, created a clearer picture of the dynamics leading up to the shooting. Investigators did not treat any single detail as enough. Instead, they looked at how all the elements fit together. During this time, the Crespo children faced the emotional strain of losing their father, while also supporting their mother in a situation that was now part of a developing criminal case. Daniel Jr.'s role as the key witness shaped much of what happened next. He had been inside the room at the center of the conflict. He had stepped between his parents, and he had watched the last moments of the struggle unfold. His voice became one of the strongest influences in helping investigators understand what happened inside the home that day. Yet despite the clarity his account offered, the legal system still needed time to determine how to classify the shooting and what charges should follow. Public attention remained strong. News outlets continued airing past clips of Daniel at community events, while new updates about the investigation appeared across local and national platforms. Opinions shifted from simple disbelief to more nuanced discussions. Some viewers felt sympathy for Lydia as more details emerged about the struggles inside the home. Others believed the shooting demanded a stronger reaction. Still, the community's emotions, whether supportive or critical, did not determine the direction of the legal process. The district attorney's office relied only on evidence, statements, and the circumstances surrounding the shot that ended Daniel's life. Months passed before prosecutors announced formal charges. Lydia Crespo was charged with voluntary manslaughter, a decision that reflected both the seriousness of the shooting and the evidence of long-term tension that had contributed to the confrontation. The charge surprised some members of the public who expected a more severe accusation, but legal experts explained the reasoning clearly. The charge acknowledged that Lydia had fired the gun and caused Daniel's death, yet also recognized the complex and escalating conflict that had taken place moments before the shot. The case was no longer just about a single moment. It was about years of tension that had built toward one breaking point. Once charged, Lydia prepared for the next stage of the legal process. Her attorneys emphasized the long-term emotional strain inside the home and the immediate danger she said she faced during the final confrontation. Prosecutors, meanwhile, focused on building a clear narrative of the events and matching it with the evidence collected. Both sides understood that the case would likely come down to how closely the law viewed her actions in the context of fear and self-defense. As the case moved forward, public interest grew again, but now in a quieter, more reflective way. Residents of Bell Gardens had spent years seeing the Crespo family at community events, and many struggled to understand the contrast between the public image and the private life revealed through the investigation. The story of Daniel's rise in local government and coaching paired with Lydia's claims of fear and emotional strain, created a complicated portrait that people found difficult to reconcile. But the legal process continued methodically, separating emotion from evidence. Eventually, after years of preparation and multiple legal discussions, Lydia reached an agreement with prosecutors. She chose to accept responsibility for voluntary manslaughter under a plea deal. In doing so, she acknowledged her role in the shooting while also presenting the history that had led her to believe she faced immediate danger on the day of the confrontation. Her confession marked one of the final major steps in the lengthy legal journey. It allowed both sides to resolve the case without a prolonged trial, which could have deeply impacted the children and extended the emotional toll on everyone involved. With her confession accepted, sentencing followed. The court recognized several important factors: the years of tension described by Lydia, the corroboration provided by her son, the lack of planning or premeditation, and the reality that the confrontation had escalated suddenly. Because of these elements, the judge determined that prison time was not necessary. Instead, Lydia was sentenced to 3 years of probation and ordered to complete 500 hours of community service. The decision surprised some observers, but aligned with the legal interpretations of the evidence. For the Crespo family, the sentencing marked the end of a long, painful chapter. Daniel Jr. and his sister continued adjusting to a life changed permanently in a matter of seconds. Their mother, now carrying both the weight of the shooting and the responsibility of rebuilding what remained of her family, stepped away from public view. The city, too, moved forward, eventually electing new leaders, continuing community programs, and trying to heal from an event that had become one of the most widely reported tragedies in its history. The case left behind a complicated legacy. It was a story of a respected public figure whose private struggles remained hidden until a single argument escalated beyond control. It was also the story of a wife who said she lived in fear, a son who tried to protect his family, and a moment that changed their lives forever. Years later, the Daniel Crespo case continues to be remembered not only because of the public profile of those involved, but because it highlighted the unseen pressures that can shape a family's life behind closed doors. It remains a reminder that even the most familiar public faces may be living lives much more complicated than anyone realizes, and that the line between stability and crisis can sometimes be thinner than it appears.